Okay, thanks, Jake, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Are you all having a good time at the conference?
Yeah.
Yes? No? Or are you kind of a little dazed after lunch? Okay, the reason I just want to first start talking about the reason why I kind of picked this topic for this conference. Many of you may be wondering, immigration is what we are kind of doing. There's tax, that's fine. But then why culture, right? We've been talking about the human aspect or the people aspect of things. There were several conversations, and I've been, listening to a lot of references to the employee. And, yesterday Umesh was talking about customer support, customer success, and then customer experience. So if you look at global mobility as a whole, what is the customer experience that we are looking at? I mean, the employee is at the center of this whole thing, right, from an organizational perspective. And so what is the employee experience, and how are we kind of handling that? Someone goes from one country to another, what is the cultural adjustment that someone needs to make? And are we kind of taking care of this? Or are we just sending people over and kind of letting them sink or swim? So the question is, the reason why I brought this topic in is global mobility. When we talk of global mobility, it has several pillars. One is immigration. The other one is compensation and tax. We do have a session on that, every year. And I want everyone to kind of look at it because it's a pretty serious subject. It's just not that, immigration is what we need to be doing all along, but we need to be looking at tax component as well. The third thing is culture, which also involves, looking at how are you relocating someone from one place to another. So how many companies are doing some kind of a cultural training or an orientation prior to people are leaving? So I have some 3 questions that I kind of put together. And one of them, which I would like you to answer, or 2 of them that I would like you to answer, is on how important is culture training, and how many of you do culture training before an assignment. So if you can get that on Slido, we will keep going. I mean, you can answer that, and we will look at, what we have here. Okay? So, all right. This is something about what I wanted to kind of tell you about the culture shock. And I was reading this, and I kind of thought this is pretty important. There was a survey done for about, and about 88% of the people said they had difficulty adjusting when they moved to a new country. So that means there's a big gap in terms of what's being done. This is a global data, okay? It's not India data. So globally, people are kind of saying that 88% are finding it difficult to adjust. And if you look at, the other numbers, it's kind of self-explanatory. I'm just not going to go through that, in detail, each one of those. But you also look at the other numbers, it says, yeah, it has an effect on my, on the individual on their work style, work habits and their lifestyle. So what does that mean? I mean, when I'm getting into a new culture, when I'm into a new country, how am I adjusting socially and also at work? So that's a key thing. And I wanted to see how many of you really are doing some kind of a cultural training here. The hard facts, like I said, if you take C-Comply, for example, we do immigration and tax. Those are, again, 2 hard fact areas that need to be addressed, so we've taken that. But down the road, we would like to kind of bring in partners who will give you a full service. So bring in cultural training, relocation, and all that, so that the entire global mobility package is what is being addressed. And organizations are looking at one-stop solutioning rather than, looking at multiple vendors to be, contacted to do any of these things. If you look at, There are actually no hard metrics that I could really find. I don't know how many companies do really collect metrics on how successful is a global assignment when someone is sent overseas and brought back. There are a few companies that really do it well. Global mobility, in fact, I mean, people being assigned on international assignments is primarily for, career development and things like that.
It's kind of quiet. I can't hear.
So it's for career development, and for career growth, etc. And I don't know how many companies really effectively handle this component. If you look at a GE or a Unilever or some of them, they've been doing it very well. But, if I look at from an IT perspective, I'm not very sure, how well this is kind of getting handled. If you look at, like I said, the metrics is not available most of the time. And if you look at the stress factors that are involved. So we are looking at an individual who is traveling and going to a new country. So there is a lot of stress, one on the individual and also on the family. So what is it that makes the individual go through these stresses? The initial, I would say, the euphoria of being identified for a foreign assignment, et cetera, is all great. But then comes all the issues of tackling the visas that you need to get for you and your family, and then packing your stuff and then moving. And then you move to a new country, then you need to be settling down there. The initial process of settling is not going to be that easy again. How do I, what should I do? Where should I find my housing? Where should I kind of put my children in school? How do I manage my spouse who was working earlier or not working earlier? And what's going to happen, in that new environment? Then making the cultural adjustments. So we'll come to that later. Then at work, how do I adjust myself at work? What is expected? And how do I manage that? I'll give you a practical, story or an experience that I went through. On the tech world, we've been packaging people, sending them out, right? I had this person who was in Florida. So he just moved maybe, a few months back. And then he was settling down, he was at work, and then he had two children. One was about 3 years old, the other was probably 1 year old, and his spouse was at home. So this small kid was put into play school. So the boy was going to the play school every day. So he hurt his finger one day at home, and then, they kind of put a Band-Aid around it and then sent him to school, right? The next day, he was playing at the play school, and then he hurt his finger again and started bleeding. So when that happened, the play school teacher asked him, just imagine, it's a 2-year, 3-year-old kid. If you say, how did you get hurt? Kid couldn't answer. So she said, did your mom hurt you? Or your dad hurt you or something? The kid said yes, right? So they immediately called 911. And then, they came, they took the child, put the child into foster care, and then, went home, took the mom and put her in custody, and then gave the younger 1-year-old to the dad and said, we can't do anything. That's what it is. It's, you have, the child has been abused, so we can't do anything about it. So this poor guy is standing there. He doesn't know what to do, right? How do I address this? And he has this 1-year-old. And I get a frantic call, and then, we sort it out. I talk to the attorney. But look at what is the underlying factor here is understanding the cultures and also the sensitivity around this. The teacher could have possibly posed this question without a yes or a no answer, right? And, being a kid, they could have. But eventually what happened when we tried to sort it out was they sent somebody from foster care to check with the neighbors, and then they released the child. So this is what happened. So why I'm saying that is it's a lot of cultural differences that could come into play, and people kind of get stressed out because of that. So So these stress factors are high, and then, how do we handle that? And then there was another question that I was looking at. The third question also that I want you to all answer is, have you ever had any cultural issues because of which people came back, after an assignment? While on this, another thing that I wanted to tell you is in this global mobility world that we are in, we have HR handles most of the time the mobility piece as well. And the global data says only about 11% of the people have lived outside their home countries. So they have this additional challenge of understanding when they're doing all this global mobility, how to, putting themselves in the employee's shoes and then looking at what are all the practical problems that someone will face and then handle this end to end. So this is something, that you need to be really thinking through, and how well and how can we do that. So between cultures, there are quite a few stories or funny stories that you can keep talking about, but I'll probably let Jake address that. He's kind of good at that. But in the meanwhile, I was kind of looking at someone was saying that when they were doing training in Africa and people were coming late to the training, they said, you're being late, you need to be on time. And they said, yeah, you have a wristwatch, but I have time. So we have all the time in the world. So that's the kind of culture that you are in. Then you need to be a little careful of what you're doing and how you're saying things and what we're doing. The other thing is, the social versus the work culture. And I was kind of looking at this, how flexible are you in terms of adapting? In this, I must say that Jake's son, who's here actually, is a 13-year-old boy. He's kind of absolutely adjusted himself. This is his first visit to India. And, he's been having local food, Indian food. He's not asked me for an American food so far. So he's kind of culturally getting immersed into this whole thing. He's kind of going around, seeing things, happily having Indian food. And one of that's what I've said here is, you shouldn't be going around finding a McDonald's if you are an American visiting India, but get used to having chapati and dal. Mm-hmm. And one of the panel members said, no, it should be dosa and sambar. So there's a bit of a contention there. But otherwise, if you look at cultural flexibility, you'll have to understand what the culture is that you're getting into. If you're sending someone into Japan, right, we have had so many, I would say we have learned so much from the Japanese in terms of from the manufacturing perspective, the quality circle, Six Sigma, black belt and all that. But if you look at now, Japan is opening up. At least about 5 years back, one of the trends I was saying was Japan is going to open up for immigration because of the demographics. The population is aging, the birth rates were going down, and they necessarily have to import labor to continue. So that's what is happening. Now, how much do we know about Japanese culture? How much are we going to be training our people? Language training plus cultural training before we send anyone. There's this thing like, how much do I need to bow if I'm in Japan, based on the levels, the hierarchy. You bend low if the person is senior in the organization. That's what I hear. But I'm saying those are things that are critical, those are important when you look at it. I've given you a Disney story here about the flexibilities simply because there was this guy from the US who was assigned to Europe to manage the Disney business as the CEO, and he was kind of thinking that family and alcohol don't mix. And so in the Disney parks, there was no alcohol served. And then, Disney wasn't doing well. Business was not doing well. Then he kind of started finding out what the reasons are. It's simple that the French always wanted to have a glass of wine with lunch. And so he had to go back to his corporate headquarters and tell them that, this is not working because we need to serve wine in Europe if we need to kind of get our business going. So you need to kind of understand what the local culture is and then adapt, even if you're a business. One is, the people getting adjusted into the new culture. The other is the business kind of looking at it. So the same way, the Korean, the auto manufacturer that I've talked about is more about the person being absolutely aggressive and was able to kind of get things done in the US. But when he went to Korea, Korea is more like a consensus culture. It's difficult if you kind of tell people what they should be doing or be aggressive with them. So you need to kind of get their buy-in, do a consensus. So a whole bunch of things when you talk about culture. And that's an important aspect that I wanted to bring forth so that it's just not global mobility is not simply in immigration and tax, but we need to be really focusing on other areas as well. So let's look at the questions before I kind of turn this over to Jake, and Jake has a few interesting slides as well. So do we have some answers to the Slido? So that will, your response is going to kind of set how we are. All right, how important, I think people are saying 75% in terms of how important is cultural training before an assignment. Okay, good. We have question number 2. Does your company do a cultural training? Yes, 67%, no, 33%. I'm really encouraged that 67% of you answered that there is training, but then I see a response of only 13. So I don't, the others don't do it. Don't do it at all. Okay. So you want to have assignments ended early because of cultural issues that the assignee could not adjust. No, 78%. Yes, 22%. That's nice. Good to hear. Because there have been several assignments that have ended because they couldn't really adjust to the new culture. Good, but it's, you know, if you look at US and India, I'm pretty much sure that there is a lot of inclusive culture. Like I was saying, you know, I went to Bank of America the other day before I came to India, and everyone was dressed up for Diwali in the US. I first thought I went into the wrong bank or the wrong place, but then everyone was very nicely dressed, and, you know, the person who was at the front office kind of said, yeah, please come in, and then I said, okay. Took me a few seconds to understand that, yeah, people have embraced or become more inclusive. The only thing is, yeah, the cultures have probably become more inclusive, but then the countries not inclusive, but making it more, you know, protectionist. We'll leave it there, and then I'll let Jake take over.
Cool. I was just, do you have the changer or the clicker for
It's on.
the slide?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Thank you. So, yeah, I was looking at the statistics there, and even 20% or 15% of the assignments ending because of a cultural problem, that seems like a lot. The investment is so high in deploying people out to these countries, and whatever clients they're serving and just the whole process of it is a great investment of time and resources. For something to fail, that's a tragedy. And if it could be prevented by training or some other kind of preventative measures, that would be highly valuable. Hey, could you put those slides that I put up there? Do you know where those are? The 4? John? You know the 4 slides? So, while this is going, while it's starting, a long time back when I was younger, I was sent on an assignment to a third world country in a Spanish-speaking area. And I grew up in California where everything was well developed and infrastructure is so nice and everything. It was a bit of a shock. There was a lot of things I didn't expect to see. The language was difficult. The heat, it was so hot there. It was just a lot of adjustments, and culturally I had some things that were very difficult to manage for myself. But the people were so friendly and warm that, of course, helped me to overcome, and I was able to survive. But one of the things that, I was living with people from the region and spending time and living in close proximity with everybody. And so there's bound to be some challenges there, especially when you're working or living close together 24/7. So one of the things that happened, and if I can, I don't know if John's finding my slide. We close? All right, anticipation, drum roll. Yes. So one of the things that kept happening is every time I would go into the bathroom, the restroom, I would notice that the seat, you know, the place where you sit is down on the toilet. This one. This is a toilet seat. And it's down, and there's pee there, urine, like all the time, every time. And I'm thinking, this is not okay. This is not a good standard. This is like disrespectful, maybe. I'm feeling disrespected because I go in there and it's just, that's not a nice thing to find. So it's bothering me. And eventually I go to ask. And I think this is something that I want to point is like, when you are in another country, in another culture, and you find something you're not understanding, or you feel like you feel offended, or you're not appreciating the thing, or you feel disrespected, maybe it's time to be a little curious and think like, why? Why would somebody do that? Maybe there's a reason. There could be some kind of purpose, or it may just be a different approach that they have. And so one of the guys, I asked my coworker, and I'm like, hey, so what is this? How come, every time I go in, it's like this? And they go, oh, this is a guard. This is the thing that would keep the pee from going on the place where you want to sit. It's like a guard. You lift it when you want to sit in the place that would keep it clean underneath. Okay, he had a different reason. And then I started to think a little bit. Most of these guys, they were using a bathroom like this one before they came into this work environment. Maybe at their homes they grew up, they didn't have any kind of indoor plumbing or something like that where they would use a normal toilet. And that made me think maybe a little bit about my attitude that I was expecting them to be somewhere here, and they were never exposed to this kind of information. They never knew what to do. They were never given any training or understood maybe what they should be doing. It changed my point of view, and I think that's what happens when we enter another culture, when we go into a new environment, and we take the time to be curious and maybe ask a question or step back and look at the situation. We could be open to a paradigm shift where before we were feeling offended or we thought, that's really inappropriate. Now we think we have compassion and we have maybe a concern for them and we want to help them come up, and we look at them differently. And so that's what I wanted to add to this one. Thanks.
So I was actually talking to Gerard, and then he is actually responsible for change management, culture, and compliance in his organization, right, in his role. So it was very interesting to know that those 3 C's is what kind of handles, culture, when I say organizational culture. So I was telling him that, and he's kind of traveled extensively, so he can share some of his experiences with you. The ideal thing is, how do you kind of have an assignee settle into a social culture, into the society that he's moving into? And also, what adjustments do you need to make at work, right? The work culture. So,
thanks, Sruthi.
All yours, Gerard.
Yeah, it really was interesting to hear both Jake and Sruthi, because that's something which has been very close to what I'm doing right now in terms of mergers and acquisitions, where culture is a huge kind of a challenge. Culture not only at a socio-cultural perspective, but also from a corporate culture perspective. And the complexity is even further compounded primarily because of subcultures which also exist. In fact, when I saw the slide on chapati and dal, I was wondering why Bismillah was not there, especially when you're in Bangalore, or why Idli Sambar was not there. We do have these cultural divides. And the point which Jake also beautifully brought out is ignorance. The curiosity is which will fill the culture gaps which exist between various cultures across the globe. For example, when I had gone to the US for the first time and we had the opportunity to attend a baseball game, and somebody was trying to relate baseball with cricket. Yes, cricket and baseball both are bat games and ball games, but they are as different as apples and oranges. I mean, they have run there too, but I still couldn't figure out what a home run was. I could figure out what a 6 or a 4 is, but a home run is totally different. So those are the kind of divides that we face day in and day out. An interesting thing which the survey also brought out is a kind of a paradox. Even though we do not have 100% cultural training, people still manage. People still have that particular innate ability in them to, based on curiosity, or to understand what is happening in terms of managing. Yes, 10 years back or 20 years back, there were huge challenges. There has definitely been in terms of not to wash any dirty linen in public. What happens is people from India used to go and wash their dirty linen in public. Right? And that was an embarrassment. People used to come back and say, hey, look, this is what is happening. Why are they hanging out clothes outside their balcony or their windows and things like that in hotel rooms or in service apartments? All those were challenges. But today, thanks to the information explosion, people have, to a very great extent, bridged those gaps. But still, there are challenges in terms of mingling, in terms of really understanding, in terms of really understanding the viewpoint, not only from a host perspective, but also from a receiving perspective. What I mean by the training which you're talking about is predominantly most of the training which you do is people, let's say, going from country A to country B. We train the people who are going from country A. But we should also look at enculturation in terms of the managers to whom these individuals will be reporting into, the co-workers, the stakeholders who, from a client perspective, there are clients. Certain effort needs to be taken in terms of preparing them also in terms of in terms of preparing them also. The third and final aspect I'd want to cover is culture is a very, very difficult thing to measure. There have been some amount of studies. A Dutch sociologist called Gerard, if I remember his name correct, did make some pioneering kind of studies, typically based on the IBM workers. But even there, the various parameters which he has come across, some in terms of the decision-making ability, in terms of uncertainty, situations where in terms of where how inclusive culture or how people deal with uncertainty, how people deal with a masculine versus a feminine kind of an approach. So all these are various aspects in terms of where culture can be measured. We do have a long way to go. Today we are depending on the ability of our own individuals to survive in those kind of environments. The training, especially if it's a short term, not much is focused. Today people definitely do manage. We're also looking at, especially in terms of where today managers manage people across multiple cultures, not only from an immigration perspective, from a mobility perspective, where people, even in India, manage across multiple cultures. So that is another area where we have a lot of work to do.
Okay.
Anything else?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Gerard. You have anything to add, Jake? What I wanted to kind of share is there are a couple of things. One is, when we talk about the work culture, people getting into a different culture and starting to work, is that how well are they making the adjustment? How are they, I just kind of let that open in terms of how do you manage conflict at the workplace? So that's something that, Gerard, you want to kind of,
Yeah.
take down.
There are always differences of opinion. There are always divergent kind of viewpoints. First of all, we have to find out if those differences are emanating from a cultural perspective. Most often than not, it might not be a cultural difference, but it could be a simple difference which we could have with any of our coworkers in our own environment. But if it has been definitely identified as the root of that particular conflict being in culture, so then it predominantly is an issue of ignorance. So that is where we look at education. Educating would involve on both sides. Educating would involve in trying to understand the perspective. Again, the toilet seat example is a classic example. It is just a perspective. I mean, they were not exposed to such an environment earlier, so they assumed, based on that that is what the purpose of that particular device was. And that is where his curiosity overcome in terms of really trying to find out what went wrong. And this has been a problem. In fact, I think the Indian tendency was touched upon in one of our earlier panelists also is we do not have, as Indians, the propensity to ask, to be curious. We look at it as a sign of disrespect or we are a little diffident that way. So that is something which we need to overcome and need to educate our people in terms of being a little more open. Yes, there are ways in terms of asking a question. There are ways in terms of being curious without being disrespectful. Like, going back to the same example, look, ask a co-worker whom you're a little more friendly or comfortable with in dealing in such sensitive or embarrassing kind of situations and get those issues resolved internally and then translate that into institutionalizing across the organization as far as managing cultural conflicts.
I was just thinking to add that I've been working in my organization to understand my coworkers from a personality perspective. You've seen they have those personality tests. Oh, this person is a free spirit, or this person is more of task-minded. These people are more, people-oriented, or so on. And all of these different categories that they have tell you something about that person and help you to manage the culture in your office or in your environment. I think it's true in the same way like, each nationality or each country is going to bring a certain kind of type, a personality type, certain aspects. Not everybody fits in the mold, but there may be some generalizations. We should step away from thinking of them as maybe any kind of weaknesses or challenges, but just that it is what it is. There's pros and there's cons about everything. But knowing the landscape, understanding where your challenges are, or maybe where you may be very strong in a task-minded way, but not so much in that people-oriented or curiosity or whatever. But taking the time to build up the resources or the structure around yourself, surrounding yourself with the resources you need to fill in the gaps and to see that, ahead of time and know that, we're going to need a little help here, we're going to need a little help there. We might need more people of this type or that type to help round out our specific strengths or weaknesses. It's a highly valuable thing. And again, not seeing it as something to be afraid of or to be shy, to step back from, but this is an asset. Having these differences is really an asset, I think, culturally.
Thank you, Jake. And one last thing that I want to tell you is, when we're talking about all this culture and things like that, one of the experience that I had was, one of the employees who was on an assignment at a client site, made a remark when a lady passed by, okay? He kind of said something in the local language to the friends who were standing with him. And unfortunately, the lady thought he made some offensive remark, so went and complained to the HR manager. So, then when we kind of went into, investigating and finding out what happened, the guy kind of made some other remark in his local language, and it was never intended to be offensive to that lady. But that's how she perceived it, because when walking by and when someone made that remark, she thought he made some lewd remark at her. And that's how, and then, we had to go through a whole bunch of sexual harassment training for the team there, just that they know about it. I know India now has its own sexual harassment policy, but, all this kind of an orientation or, making sure that people understand that when they're going into a different culture, they really understand and appreciate. That's I think, is the key here. And like I said, again, I would keep on reiterating about immigration tax and then, any of the people and culture-related issues that you need to be handling when you're really looking at mobility as a whole and not just in parts. So if you really work, in the global mobility side, please go and talk to your finance person and engage him on a conversation for tax and, work out your compensation and get your people trained before they go on an assignment. So I actually would like to can we stop here because for want of time, so that we give the next panel a little bit
Some more time?
Yeah.
Some breaks?
We can take the questions, we can give the break, whatever.
I had a question. So maybe you've successfully implemented training programs. What are some key factors to consider in implementing a cultural awareness or training program in your organization for you guys? Gerard?
Take that.
One, it has to be something which is customizable to a particular environment. Here, one size fits all is not going to work. To quote an example, we had a scenario where one of the companies that we had acquired, one of the employees had 2 payrolls running for him. And in a little more an enterprise-wide application which we were using, it threw up as a person with 2 employee numbers and as if he was getting paid twice. Now, the company, because it was by virtue of it being a smaller company, our systems and processes were not able to attune to that kind of a scenario. And we were really wondering whether some kind of a fraudulent practice was going on with the earlier company. And then we realized that that was what was happening, and that was very acceptable as a local law of the land of that particular region was concerned, because he was working 2 weeks in one particular country and 2 weeks in another country. And he was on the payroll of both countries. And his families were covered in terms of insurance on both these particular countries. And that is where we really opened up to the fact that our systems and processes today are not ready to manage these kind of scenarios. In fact, one of the earlier panelists also was talking about a global citizen. Today, at least the next generation, I mean Generation Y or Generation Z or whatever you might call it, at least 20 to 30% of them think of themselves as global citizens or netizens or whatever you might call it. We are not very far away where there is going to be a digital kind of a change where a lot of these issues would, especially by the gig economy, is going to kind of change all these particular issues. So the more and more we customize our training, maybe not at an individual level, but at least at a country specific level, with nuances of understanding even subcultures, that is one particular aspect. The second aspect, of course, is to look at the wider, the systems and processes which needs to support these kind of cultural training. If you have a lot of training from the soft perspective, but your infrastructure, but the harder aspects do not support it, then the entire process is again going to fail. So these I would consider the 2 major areas from not only from a training perspective, but also from a integration perspective, which needs to be supported.
Anything else?
Cool. All right, well.
So I think for one of time, I'll probably take questions when we have the break, if there are any. But I would rather,
Give some
wrap
break.
this session and then,
All right.
we need a break, because I think we have one more session after this, right?
I think it's break time now, and then we'll come back and wrap up conference.
Right.
All right? Thank you. Gerard, stay here, and I think there will be some appreciation. Yeah, here.